In this screencast, we are going to do some data processing on data that could be obtained from a simple psychometric survey. So let's say we're doing a study looking at the relationship between a person's perceived level of stress and two personality variables. For example, sociability and introversion-extroversion. For simplicity, let's assume that each of these three psychometric variables are measured by psychometric scales, each with 3 items. So for example, an item on the psychometric scale that measures perceived stress might be the question, in the last month, how often have you been upset because of something that happened unexpectedly? And the 5 possible responses to this item are the options: never, almost never, sometimes, fairly often, and very often. And these 5 options correspond to the numerical scores of 1 for never to 5 for very often. If that was the type of study that we were doing, that is a survey based on 3 psychometric scales, each with 3 items whose responses are on a 5-point scale, then we would obtain data that looks like the data that we see in this worksheet here. In this worksheet, each row corresponds to the responses provided by a given subject. So for example, this row here corresponds to the responses given by a subject with an ID of 7. This row here corresponds to the responses given by the subject with an ID of 3, and so on. The columns, on the other hand, correspond to the individual psychometric items in the scales. I've color-coded these columns so that the items from the same scale have the same color. So these 3 columns here could correspond to the items from the sociability scale. These 3 columns could correspond to the items from the introversion scale, and these 3 here could correspond to the items from the stress scale. As you can see, the numbers here range in value from 1 to 5, and these are of course the numerical responses given by the subjects to the items in the survey. So, for example, if we just click randomly on one of the cells here, this here would be the from subject with an ID of 3 and would be his or her response to item 2 on the second scale, which is the introversion scale. On the other hand, this would be from the subject with an ID of 6 and would be his or her numerical response to item 2 on the third psychometric scale, which is our stress scale. Now, generally what we want to do with these scores is to aggregate across the items in each scale so as to produce a single numerical score for each psychometric variable. The default or most common way of doing this is to simply sum across the items. So, for example, to produce a single numerical score for the first psychometric variable, for subject 1, we would simply add up these 3 numbers, 5, and 4, and 2, to get 12. And then 12 would be the single numerical value for subject 1 on the first psychometric variable. This summing over values is a very simple process and very simple to do in Excel too. But it is complicated by the presence of so-called reverse-coded items. A reverse-coded item is one where the meaning of its numerical responses are different to what they normally are. So for example, in the stress scale item that we mentioned earlier, namely the question, in the last month, how often have you been upset because of something that happened unexpectedly? A response of very often has a numerical value of 5, and this would indicate a high level of stress. On the other hand, a reverse-coded stress scale item might be the question, in the last month, how often have you been able to control irritations in your life? Here, a response of very often, which again would correspond to a numerical score of 5, would be consistent with a low level of stress. So to properly aggregate across items, some of which are reverse-coded, we must first transform the numerical scores of the reverse-coded items. Now this transformation is simply a matter of mapping one range of numbers, say the numbers 1 to 5, to a new range of numbers, the numbers 5 to 1. So, for example, if an item is reverse coded and a person's original numerical score on that item is a 5, we would first transform that 5 to a 1 before we would do the aggregation. Or if their original score was 4, we would transform that to a 2, and so on, and then do the aggregation. Transforming scores to deal with reverse-coded items using Excel is very easy. To see how this is done, let's first open a blank worksheet. Now let's say we're dealing with an item, like ones we've been dealing with so far, that have numerical responses that range from 1 to 5. If an item like this was reverse-coded, we would need to transform the range of values 1 to 5 to the range of values 5 to 1. To do this in Excel, we would use the function equals 6 minus, and then click on the cell with the value we want to transform, and then press return, and we get the new value, which in this case, as you can see, is 5. We would then apply that function to all values in a range using the fill operation. And as you can see, this will map the numbers 1 to 5 to 5 to 1. Now, if you've been dealing with an item that is not on a 5-point scale, but rather on, for example, a 7-point scale, you would follow not exactly the same procedure, but one quite similar. Instead of doing 6 minus the original number, you would now do 8 minus the original number. So, after applying this function to one cell, we could then fill it down to apply it to the entire range. And as you can see, doing this, in this case, will map the numbers 1 to 7 to the numbers 7 to 1. So in general then, the reverse coding a item on a k point scale, where k is 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever, can always be done by 1 greater than k minus the original number, and so on. Now we are going to aggregate across the responses to each of the 3 psychometric scales to get a single numerical value for each psychometric variable. And we're going to do this in such a way as to take into account any reverse-coded items. To do this, we are first going to create a copy of this worksheet, or a copy of the data in this worksheet. But rather than doing a straight copy and paste, what we're going to do instead is create links or references between the cells in a new worksheet and the cells in this original one. So to do that, first we go into a blank worksheet and click on cell A1. We then type equals to indicate that we are inputting a formula rather than inputting a value. And now we click on cell A1 of the original worksheet. As you can see, this makes cell A1 in sheet 2 link or refer to cell A1 in sheet 1. We can now apply fill operations to apply this formula across the columns and then down the rows. Having done this, we now have all the cells that we see here in sheet 2 being just links to the cells with the data in the original sheet 1. To do the aggregation, the first thing we want to do is to do the transformation of the reverse-coded items. Now, this data set is made-up data, but let's just say that item 2 on the first psychometric scale is reverse-coded, and also that item 1 on the third scale is reverse-coded. We'll change the format of these two, of the cells in these two columns to bold, italics, and centered in order to indicate this. We now want to apply our reverse code transformation to all the values in these two columns. To do this, we'll click on the cell corresponding to the first item in the first scale for the first subject, and then apply the transformation function that we spoke about earlier. That is 6 minus the number we need to transform. So as you can see, what just happened was that 4 was mapped to 2. We can now apply this formula to all the cells in this column by a fill operation. We now do the exact same thing to the second item to be transformed. In other words, we apply the 6 minus the value of the cell to be transformed to this cell. And then we fill down across all the cells in the column. Now we are ready to sum across the items in each scale. To do this, we'll go to a new blank worksheet and apply the sum, the SUM function, to the 3 numbers that correspond to the responses of subject 1 to the 3 items in the first psychometric scale. To do that, we type in this cell equals sum, open bracket, and then select the appropriate 3 cells in sheet 2. And then close bracket and press return. And the number that we see now in this cell is the sum of the 3 responses of subject 1 to the items in the first psychometric scale. Now we'll do the exact same thing to the remaining 2 psychometric scales. Again, for both of these cases, we'll type in first equals sum, open bracket, and then select the relevant cells in sheet 2, and then close bracket and return. Now we'd like to apply these formulas to all the rows, and we'll do this using the fill operation as usual. One way of doing that, of course, the normal way would be just to simply select the cells and then drag, and that will apply the formulas to the cells that you've dragged over. An alternative way of doing this, which is generally quicker, is to first copy the 3 cells, and then up in the address bar up here, we type in the range of cells B2 to B101, and that would be B2 colon B101. And that selects the cells B2 to B101, as you can see. And now we press Ctrl V, and we apply the formulas to all the rows in that range. All that remains now is to do a bit of cleanup. The first thing we want to do is just to provide some labels for the 3 psychometric variables that we have produced. And we'll just type those in. And next we want to place in the first column there the column of subject IDs, which is in the previous worksheets. The easiest way of doing this is just to do a simple copy and paste. And now our job is completed. For each subject, we have aggregated across all the items in each of the 3 psychometric scales, and we've done this in such a way that we properly take into account the fact that there are reverse coded items.